Good afternoon all, and welcome to another episode of When Tomorrow Comes. You'll quickly work out that I'm neither Ian or Charlotte. Ian's on leave this week and forgot to mention that, so I've stepped in to chair this week's edition. And this week we're talking about zoning, and I'm pleased to say that we've got a special guest this week. Simon Ricketts from Town Legal is joining us. We've got Ashley Cook from Iceni Projects and Katie Inglis from Iceni. So Katie, in kind of normal format, if I ask you to just introduce your Wednesday email and kind of the main contents of that, and then we'll go into a bit more of a debate and discussion around that.
Yeah, sure. So I don't think I'm coming up on the screen now. I am. Okay, sorry. My Wednesday email was about what could we learn from the Australian zoning systems that I've worked in. And, you know, there's lots of talk and speculation about the planning reforms that are due imminently, or some detail is due imminently. And that got me thinking, you know, zoning is on top of the list being talked about at the moment for this reform. And having worked in 3 zone-based planning systems in Australia, what elements could we take or could we look at to implement here? Completely acknowledging that no planning system is perfect and it cannot deal with every site circumstance. And so I look at, well, what is the system in Queensland? There's 3 levels of development, 1 in which you don't require planning permission, 2 in which you require planning permission, 1 which is assessed against the codes for the zones. If you meet the codes, the use, you generally don't require public consultation or democratic decision making, i.e. you're not required to go to planning committee. And the 3rd route is the impact assessable development, whereby you do have public consultation and you are required to have democratic decision making, and that's typically for much larger developments that may be more controversial. And then I've also considered in New South Wales, they have a standardised local plan with codes and zones that are standardised, that at local plan creation they adapt and alter to local circumstance. And I think that would be really helpful here. I don't know about others out there, but when you're looking for how the garden size depth in local plans, you don't know if you're looking at policy T4 here or SPX, you know, whatever it is, and you're having to read a large amount of preamble and policy to find what you're looking for. Standardized local plan policies, codes, visions can be really helpful in streamlining that process. So my opinion is that a zone-based system can be helpful in making the system easier to navigate through, especially for smaller developments that really shouldn't have as hard a time getting through the planning process.
Thank you for that, Katie. And Simon, you've written a lot about this on your vlog. So why haven't the UK adopted this approach before, and why is it only now that it's being talked about?
Well, first of all, it was a really good piece by Kate, and much more interesting than any of my pieces. I'm reminded of that old REM song, "Can't Get There From Here." I mean, we have our own, you know, legal system, planning system, economic and social pressures, and we have a planning system that reflects all of that. It's really interesting to hear how other legal systems with other pressures and priorities have developed in different ways, but we shouldn't assume we can just go from one to the other without you know, real stresses and strains. You know, we all know that we're waiting for this planning policy paper from government, maybe later this week, maybe next week. And I think what we've got to look out for is whether in this, you know, group that's been working on ideas, it's going to be the visionaries that win out or the pragmatists. Because, you know, when we talk about moving to a zone-based system, which was all sort of Jenrick was saying in his March paper, you know, you could interpret that in a very visionary way of moving to a system like Kate describes, or you could translate that pragmatically into saying, well, why don't we use LDOs more? Why don't we use permission in principle more? The changes we've seen to use classes order and GPDO, that's really about zoning in terms of more regulation at the upper level and then less individual development management control by authorities. So very long answer, but I think number one, we have our own complex system and our own sets of priorities and challenges and needs. And then secondly, zoning means all sorts of things to all different sorts of people. So there isn't a software package that we can buy and put into our computers and then we've got a zoning system. It's much more complicated than that.
Thank you for that, Simon. Ashley, any thoughts, observations from?
Yeah, I think just before we started this vlog recording, actually, I was sort of saying to Katie, I actually don't know how much I know about a zoning planning, and I've certainly never worked in anywhere that's had it, but I feel like I have quite strong opinions about it. And one thing that worries me is that in the UK in particular, we have very, very complex urban environments with lots of different types of uses alongside one another. And this exists because we appreciate that having a mix of uses and mixes of activity are something that is beneficial to local areas. But it's also something that I worry would become even more complicated if we had a zonal planning system, because it wouldn't be able to sort of address the complexities that just exist currently in our physical built environments. At the moment, our system allows for developers to see an opportunity to make something of the land that maybe the council hasn't necessarily anticipated coming forward. And it means that there's space for kind of innovation and growth in areas that wasn't expected, and I think that's a good thing, because it means that we can have more kind of creative approaches to design, and it means that people try and kind of test the boat with different options with local authorities. My concern would be that if we have a zoned approach, then actually it stifles this sort of innovation and creativity, because people are put off trying to do things that well, the zone says shouldn't be possible. So that's one thing I'd be concerned about. But obviously we don't know exactly what it is that's going to come forward. And I think that something that sort of Katie has suggested is that, well, there are different types of zonal planning, and there are different types that work in different areas. So I don't know whether Katie has any idea of maybe the type that would work for the UK, and maybe if it is different to what works in Australia or elsewhere.
Yeah, well, my view is definitely not, let's take an Australian system and replicate it here, because there are differences inherently in the way that land use has formed in both countries, and the way that historically planning has come about. So, for example, in Australia, we don't do housing land supply, we don't have local affordable housing policies. So yes, there are major differences, and I'm not suggesting that it should entirely be replicated, but there are some processes by which the zoning systems and how they are set up in Australia and how they deal with certain developments, for example, potentially smaller developments, that could be replicated here to allow smaller developments through the system with a slightly easier run. The devil is going to be in the detail. So if we have a very prescriptive zoning requirement, then yes, you are going to get less flexibility than you have at present. But we can see almost a mix of that. So we can have mixed use zones that aren't overly prescriptive in terms of what is required, or we could have very prescriptive. So it's difficult at present without with very little detail on what we're going to see in terms of these transformations to determine whether or not it is actually going to be a good thing. I know that it has been suggested potentially two zones, a development zone and a non-development zone. The inherent problem that I have with that, having worked in zone-based systems, is that zones should dictate parameters, and the difficulty with having a development zone and a non-development zone is what are the parameters for development for the type of use that you're going for. So we know that an industrial development is very different from a housing development. And how do you get those controls and dictate those parameters in that zone? So I do see potentially inherent problems with an overly simplistic zone-based system. But it'll be really interesting to see what comes out of the discussion and whether or not we are going to see much more flexible zones, i.e. just housing zones, mixed use zones that have potentially a level of parameters based on, say, quantum of development, based on potential location closer to train stations or local centres, that then trigger different controls or policies in the local plan according to, say, a site's location, that then could still inherently be flexible in terms of design and layout, etc., but do provide some parameters so that you understand that that is the zone that you're in, and this is the amount or potential development option available for that zone.
I think you raise an interesting point there, Katie, about the scale of development, because we know that getting smaller schemes through the planning process can be the most complicated, and the zoning process I can envisage will support that. But Simon, in terms of the larger schemes, you've already mentioned that we've got some tools available already. We've got the ability to implement LDOs. And is it not a case that we should be just using that capability a bit further than we currently are?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. I think the tools are all there. We all know what we want to move towards, I'm sure, which is on bigger schemes. At the moment, you have 3 expensive, time-consuming, uncertain stages. You've got the allocation stage in the local plan, the outline planning permission stage, and then the reserve matter stage. And surely what we want to do somehow is to get to a stage where to a system where the allocation really effectively serves as the outline planning permission that gives sort of a bankable level of certainty that you're only then into the detail. So that can be delivered under our current system by the way in which local development orders can be framed. At the moment, they have to be brought forward by local authorities. Is that the real bar? Secondly, it can be dealt with by expanding the permission in principle regime, which was brought in but only really implemented in 2016, was only really implemented for brownfield land. But there was the idea that land could be allocated within a local plan and achieve permission in principle so that you only then needed technical details approval. That is precisely an approach to zoning. So we do have the mechanisms. We don't need to come up with some wholly different way of planning, and I hope that that's recognised, because otherwise we are going to come to some real crunchy issues about moving from our current system to another system, and people in the market will either slow down or speed up depending on what is it, and not just in the market, but local authorities will speed up or slow down depending on where they see the advantage. And we will be, we won't see more development as a result.
I'm conscious of time, and in normal fashion, Katie, is there any comments that you would like to conclude with today? Any thoughts regarding your email?
Just probably that it is going to continue to generate significant debate, and that there is no one system that is perfect. But if we're talking about transformation, understanding what zoning systems are out there and how they're utilised at present, and what could be taken from them to help speed up the planning process, should be considered to understand whether or not elements of those systems could be included in the UK system.
Thank you, Katie. Thank you, Ashley. And thank you, Simon, for joining us this week on When Tomorrow Comes. And we look forward to seeing you next week when Charlotte will be in her usual place chairing. Thanks all. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thanks.